if the world ever does heat up from the alleged man-made global warming, the United Nations and its largely unfree member regimes seem determined to make sure you endure it with no air conditioner or refrigerator. But the latest development in the UN's green agenda is about much more than waging war on prosperity, liberty, and cooling technologies under the guise of saving Mother Earth, as UN leaders made clear in recent days. The so-called green transformation of the world toward centralized control and global governance is now unstoppable and irreversible, claimed the UN environmental czar after a UN summit in Rwanda last week. At the controversial UN conference, under the pretense of battling alleged man-made global warming, close to 200 governments and dictators agreed to amend the Montreal Protocol to unleash a new jihad on important molecules used in everything from air conditioners and refrigerators to medical inhalers. Contrary to the senior UN bureaucrats' grandiose and bombastic heralding of the unstoppable new order, though, the UN's much-touted green transformation of the world is on shakier ground than ever. In fact, it could all come crashing down as soon as this year, if GOP presidential candidate Donald Trump wins and follows through on his campaign promises, or if the GOP-controlled Congress grows a spine and cuts off the tax funding. Carbon dioxide, known to scientists as the gas of life, has been public enemy number one at UN climate conferences in recent years. Establishment media organs such as the New York Times even parrot the ludicrous terminology of Al Gore, demonizing the wonderful molecule as carbon pollution. That is despite the fact, or perhaps because of it, that the beneficial gases exhaled by every human being on the planet, is essential to life, and is released by literally every human activity. At the costly UN Environment Programme, UNEP, summit in Kigali, Rwanda, a place infamous internationally for genocide and mass murder facilitated by the UN and its civilian disarmament schemes, the UN and its mostly autocratic member regimes took aim at a different supposed foe, hydrofluorocarbons, also known as HFCs, used in cooling and refrigeration. Under an amendment to an existing UN scheme, the 1987 UN Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer, national governments of more prosperous nations will start phasing out HFCs within the next few years. Dictators and corrupt governments that have impoverished poorer nations will have a decade or more to start phasing out the crucial chemicals. Richer nations such as the United States will have just a few years. Ironically, despite the name of the relevant UN regime stating that the treaty deals with ozone-depleting chemicals, nobody has yet claimed that HFCs deplete the ozone layer. In fact, HFCs were developed as a response to previous UN bans on other chemicals that allegedly depleted the ozone, though even that was never proven scientifically. In fact, it would be impossible to destroy the ozone layer anyway, since ozone is constantly being created in the atmosphere naturally. Ozone is a molecule consisting of 3 oxygen atoms, and it is formed when ultraviolet light breaks an oxygen molecule consisting of 2 oxygen molecules into its component parts, and one of the oxygen atoms combines with the O2 oxygen molecule to form ozone, O3. Put simply, so long as the oxygen in the atmosphere is not depleted and there is ultraviolet light, the ozone in the atmosphere will not be depleted either. But as the UN's chief environmental bureaucrat explained, this scheme is much bigger than just battling life-saving chemicals under the guise of supposedly controlling climate, the ozone, or anything else. It is about a fundamental transformation of the world. This is about much more than the ozone layer and HFCs, acknowledged UNEP Executive Director Eric Solheim. It is a clear statement by all world leaders that the green transformation started in Paris is irreversible and unstoppable. Chief of the brutal Saudi dictatorship's negotiating team Taha Mohammed Zaatari thanked the Islamic deity Allah for the agreement, which does not require the victims of his head-chopping regime to phase out HFCs for more than a decade. Presumably the regime's functionaries will continue using AC. perhaps anticipating some pushback as humanity's would-be overlords attack crucial molecules that have improved the lives of billions. The UN claimed super-efficient, cost-effective cooling technologies were supposedly being developed. No further details were offered in the UN's celebratory press release about these alleged super-efficient technologies allegedly being developed. There will also be new and additional wealth redistribution and technology transfer programs from Western taxpayers to Third World dictators, with the UN taking its cut. Exactly how many billions per year will be extracted from the poor and middle class in freer nations to send to the corrupt ruling classes of poorer nations will be decided at a future UN summit. The next one is scheduled for 2017 in Montreal. Despite the US Constitution, globalists and their stenographers in the establishment media are pretending that the Kigali Amendment is legally binding on the United States. The reason, they claim, is because the US Senate ratified the Montreal Protocol during the Reagan administration some 3 decades ago. The idea that the UN can amend any treaty to say anything after the US Senate ratifies it and then consider it automatically ratified, is, of course, illegal, and extremely dangerous. The Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol builds on the strong global momentum for multilateral efforts to address climate change, including the landmark Paris Agreement, which will enter into force the 4th of November, the adoption last week of a global, market-based mechanism for emission reductions by the international aviation industry, and other multilateral efforts under the United Nations Framework for Climate Change Convention, UNFC, process, said UN boss Ban Ki-moon in a statement released by his spokesman, omitting the fact that the US Senate has not ratified the UN's Paris Agreement purporting to create a global climate regime. Ironically, despite Ban's factually challenged boasting, the US government is currently prohibited by law from sending a single taxpayer dollar the UNFC. The Paris Agreement he mentioned, meanwhile, cannot possibly enter into force as it relates to the United States, as the US Senate has not even considered the radical climate regime, much less ratified it by a 2/3 majority as required in the Constitution. While anti-constitutional, the latest UN scheme is perfectly in line with previous declarations by UN bigwigs and anti-liberty extremists, especially the anti-human, anti-market, anti-prosperity leaders of the UN's alleged Environment Agency. Speaking at the first UN Earth Summit in 1992, which he led, the first UNEP boss, billionaire self-declared socialist Maurice Strong, was blunt. It is clear that current lifestyles and consumption patterns of the affluent middle class, involving high meat intake, consumption of large amounts of frozen and convenience foods, use of fossil fuels, appliances, home and workplace air conditioning, and suburban housing are not sustainable, said Strong, who was often involved in bizarre pagan religious rituals in addition to the criminal activity and totalitarian scheming. The wealthy globalist died practically unnoticed under the protection of his ideological brethren in communist China, hiding from the law amid charges that he stole millions from taxpayers as part of a UN corruption scheme. But his dangerous and cookie agenda, concocted largely by the establishment and its Club of Rome, a cabal of communists and globalists who declared humanity to be the real enemy of humanity, lives on at the UN. Consider that almost 25 years after Strong announced that air conditioning was not sustainable, the UN and its member regimes have officially launched a jihad on the key chemicals used in AC and refrigeration around the world. At the second UN Earth Summit, chaired by an anti-American Chinese communist and attended by this writer, the anti-human extremism was on full display, including bizarre posters with a doctor diagnosing the sick planet as having humans. Unsurprisingly, the Obama administration was pleased with the outcome of the UN summit in Kigali, with Obama calling it an ambitious and far-reaching solution to this looming crisis. Obama's Secretary of State John Kerry, meanwhile, spoke in messianic terms to UN negotiators in Rwanda and in Vienna before that. It is likely the single most important step we could take at this moment to limit the warming of our planet and limit the warming for generations to come, he claimed. It is the biggest thing we can do in one giant swoop. Earlier this year, Kerry ludicrously claimed the UN's HFC's jihad could literally save life on the planet itself. Former State Department climate change negotiator Andre Light was just as pompous. This will be the trifecta of international climate agreements, he said. It's just extraordinary. Apparently momentum for the UN scheme began building at a 2013 meeting between Obama and the brutal Communist Party dictator of mainland China, who has been more than willing to help Obama undermine the US economy and constitution with illegal UN climate schemes. Big business and various lobbying groups that stand to profit from the UN scheme also played a big role in driving the Kigali Amendment, according to establishment media reports. The premise behind the new UN jihad to save Mother Earth, or Gaia as some UN types refer to the deified planet, is that the chemicals supposedly contribute to climate change, which despite changing since the dawn of creation, is now attributed to mankind. Adoption of the amendment on HFCs will provide considerable benefits in the coming decades and help advance the Sustainable Development Goals, UN boss Ban said, a reference to the totalitarian global roadmap known as UN Agenda 2030 and its 17 tyranny requiring sustainability goals. Significantly, the global phase-down of HFCs could avoid up to half a degree of global warming by the end of this century, providing a major boost for efforts to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius as stated in the Paris Agreement and to pursue efforts toward 1.5 degrees, Ban added through a spokesman. Other UN and US officials made the same claim. Pretending that their discredited scientists can predict what would happen to the Earth's temperature over the next century by adjusting the level of emissions, though, is absurd, as the UN has admitted in the past. Indeed, considering the track record of the UN's discredited Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been wrong about virtually everything, the idea that the UN or anyone knows the exact effects of the new policies is highly suspect at best, much less the amount of degrees by which the climate would change 85 years from now. In 2001, though, even the UN IPCC admitted in its summary assessment report that its long-term claims on climate were not reliable. The climate system is a coupled nonlinear chaotic system, and therefore the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible, the UN outfit admitted. While much of what the UN says is demonstrably wrong, in that sentence, the IPCC was being truthful. The New American has interviewed many scientists who have served on the UN body, and virtually all of them have concluded that the outfit was an unscientific sham working to justify extremist UN policy measures with science rather than understand reality or climate. Others have boasted publicly that wealth redistribution is the real agenda. In an August 22 piece ridiculing Obama's Secretary of State Kerry, scientist Larry Bell, who heads the University of Houston's graduate program in space architecture, took aim at the entire UN anti-HFC charade. Noting that the satellite data had shown no statistically significant global warming in 2 decades, Bell said Kerry was exploiting a manufactured crisis to push his agenda. Staving off highly speculative climate impacts comes at an enormous pain and cost, said Bell, an advisor to the pro-market environmental group CFACT and the author of a book exposing the climate of corruption behind the man-made global warming hoax, adding that even top Obama officials have acknowledged there would be no measurable impact on global warming from Obama's lawless decrees. So okay, Secretary Kerry, rather than quibble about the fact that there will be no measurable benefits, why not set a noble example? Ban air conditioning in all of your agency's offices anyway. Fortunately for humanity, the latest UN scheme, the Paris Agreement, UN Agenda 2030, and all of the other recent globalist plots are built on a foundation of quicksand. With no ratification by the US Senate, the UN instruments are legally meaningless in the United States, despite Obama's rule by decree machinations pretending to give them legitimacy. They could be stopped tomorrow using various different strategies. And even if the Senate were to ever ratify the schemes, the federal government cannot grant itself new powers merely by ratifying a treaty, as America's founders and even the Supreme Court have made clear. In short, turning back the clock on the UN's schemes could be an easy task if a sufficient number of Americans were educated on the problems and the solutions. One obvious solution is to pass the American Sovereignty Restoration Act, H.R. 1205, to get the United States out of the UN in an immixit. While it will require hard work by Americans, it is possible, and essential for liberty to survive, that the whole UN